Hey there everyone, this is Joey with One Way to Make, and today we're going to be building a cedar deck. I've never built a deck before, so this is already a little bit out of my comfort zone. And to add to the challenge, it needs to be built around this beautiful circular hot tub. I hope to make it worthy of the hot tub, the house that it's attached to, and the view that it overlooks. If that wasn't enough excitement for one video, this build will also be the first in our brand new dream shop. It's got power, it's got heat, it's even got dust collection. And with a shop like this, what could go wrong? I drew up some plans to help me with the build, and since I'm building this deck modularly and moving it into place later, I'll be building it in sections. I've been told that the smartest and bravest people usually start with the hardest sections first, so naturally, I'll be starting with the easiest. I'm building this deck out of 2x6 pressure-treated lumber, which should hold up great for an exterior build. Normally you'd want a 2x8 or a 2x10 joist for a deck, but these are pretty small, and no matter how hard you tried, I don't think you could fit enough weight on them to overload the 2x6s. This deck also only sets a foot off the ground, so even if I'm wrong, the only thing that should be hurt is my ego. After laying my cut pieces out, I attach them all with some 4-inch exterior screws, and make sure to space my joists out 16 inches apart. This deck is going to be free-floating, not attached to the house at all. To do this, I'm adding 4x4 legs to all of my sections. I want my total height to be 13 inches, and my cedar decking boards are an inch thick, so I'm cutting all these legs to 12 inches. Now I know that I gave my new shop a hard time in the intro, but honestly I'm so happy to be out of my basement. It's where all my past videos have taken place, and it's worked great. But it's getting a little small for my needs, and my family's starting to get sick of sawdust covering the floors in our home and saws running at all hours of the night. The goal was to finish this garage before I started using it as a shop, but that didn't happen, so we're making the best out of what we've got. And now you'll all get to come along this journey with me as we try to make this space into a true dream shop, or at least a little less of a nightmare. If you'd like to stay updated on this and all of our upcoming projects, make sure to hit those fancy little buttons below. They're the only way the internet conductor knows which way to send the YouTube trains. Or, however it works. Our second section has a few complicated cuts, so after I build the main rectangle, I start working on my angled cuts. The 30-degree cuts can be made on my miter saw, but this section also needs a 60-degree cut, which I can't make safely on my miter saw. So for this, I pull out my table saw and a jig I made that will allow me to hold my piece vertically. As Chris from Four Eyes Furniture explains in the video I stole this jig from, holding the piece vertically allows you to cut the inverse angle of whatever you set your saw to. So if it's set to 45 degrees, you'll still cut a 45. But if your saw is set to 30 degrees, you can safely cut a 60-degree angle like I need here. Just make sure you set your blade height high enough, or you'll end up making 2 passes like this fool. Once this section is assembled, I move on to the next section, which is a little larger and a little more complicated. But all the angles are repeats of the ones we just made, and by making up a plan in advance, I already know the lengths that I need to cut. So even though it's new and a little scary, it's definitely doable. Speaking of things that are new, and of Four Eyes Furniture, this is my entry in the Rockler Try That Challenge, hosted by Chris Salamone and Sean Boyd. If you're not familiar with it, Rockler hosts an annual woodworking challenge, and this year, the challenge is simple. Try something new. For me, that means a few things. Building a deck, working with angles I never have before, and as you'll see later, trying to cut a circle out of some half-held-together boards. But just a few years ago, woodworking itself was something I had never tried before, and thought I never would. I love movies and the props that are made for them, and one day while watching a video about some forgotten space blaster or laser sword, I came across Tested and Adam Savage. They introduced me to Bill Duran, who in turn recommended the Making It podcast. Now this podcast wasn't even about movies, it was about woodworking. From here, another recommendation brought me to the Modern Maker podcast and the videos of Chris, Ben, and Mike. From that point on, I was fully on the woodworking train and let that conductor take me wherever they saw fit. So when it came time to finish my basement and fill it with furniture, I thought, why not try that? And that decision has been one of the most rewarding of my life. So if there's anything you've always wanted to try, woodworking, prop making, video editing, or anything else, I say, try that. And whatever train brought you to this station, I'm glad you're here, and thanks for watching. Once we have all of the deck bases built, I bring them to the house that they'll be installed at and set them into place. And luckily, everything fits together like it should. I was able to get these bases installed, as well as a couple of the cedar decking boards that didn't have any curves in them. After installing what I could, I took some good field measurements and headed back to the shop. Now it's time for the fun part. The goal here was to come up with a way to cut out the shape of the hot tub out of 5.5-inch wide cedar boards that are all pre-cut to fit in between the walls. The hole we're cutting needs to be lined up perfectly because the hot tub's full of water and can't be moved at all. I came up with a few ways to accomplish this, and I think they all would have worked, but the one I ended up going with starts with a template of the hot tub. To make this, I need a circle cutting jig, but none of mine are even close to being big enough, so I'm making a new one. I'm making this jig and my hot tub template out of a 4x8 sheet of 1/4-inch melamine. I used my old jig to mark out the position of my router's holes, then drilled and countersunk holes in my new jig, and sanded down the edges to be flush with the router. Then finally, I could measure and drill a hole that was 35 inches away from the outside edge of my router, which is half the diameter of the circle I want to cut. With my jig made, I screw the rest of my melamine to the workbench and find the center of the longest side. This sheet isn't big enough to make a full template of the hot tub, but that's okay. Half will work just fine for me. With my center marked, I screw my circle cutting jig into the melamine and make sure that it moves smoothly and is secure. Once I know it is, I can cut out my template. This step is really easy. I just set my plunging base to 1/4 inch under my jig and make this whole cut in one pass. And once my template is cut free, I unscrew it from my bench and give it a wiggle. Everything looks good, and I'm going to be keeping both the inside and the outside of this template. They'll both come in handy later. Before I can cut my circle out, I need to get my cedar boards cut to length and lined up in the order that I want them in. And maybe it's because I just got done working with pressure treated, but cedar's just the best, right? It's light, it mills up super easy, and it smells wonderful. It might be my underdog pick for favorite wood. Sure, walnut's an easy pick, and both red and white oak hold a special place in my heart. But for me, there's really something special about cedar. And I'd love to know, what's your pick for favorite underdog wood? The distance I want my longest board is 12 feet and 9 inches. And I have 5 boards that need some portion of a circle cut in them. So I could have started with all my boards being 12 foot 9 and cut away everything that I didn't need. But this would have created a lot of waste. So I cut each board just slightly longer than I needed to and lined them up on my workbench. And honestly, this was the trickiest part of the build. The longer pieces overhung the edge of my bench by quite a bit, and it took me a while to get them lined up and everything held in place. Eventually, I figured out that I could screw from below, through my workbench and into the bottom side of my cedar, and this really did the trick. I just needed to remember to keep my screw placement away from where my router would be cutting. Now that all my cedar boards are locked in place, I grab the outside of my template and line the center of the template up with this mark I made on site. This mark shows the exact point where the hot tub comes closest to the house. These 2 marks lining up properly are kind of what I'm betting this whole project on. If they don't, the deck won't sit properly around the hot tub, and the whole thing's kind of going to be a bust. So let's hope we got it right. My router needs to set flush with the boards I'm cutting, so I grab a scrap piece of cedar and screw it to my bench. Then I use the inside of my template to double check my positioning and mark the center of my circle on the scrap board, so that I can get my router attached in the correct spot. Finally, everything was in place and I had no more excuses. It was time to cut out this circle. For this cut, I'm going to be making multiple passes to make it all the way through these boards, but dropping my bit 1/4 inch at a time. I'm taking this step really slow so that I can reduce tear out and make sure that my router is cutting directly on the line that I marked. My first pass went well, and at this point, I had a decision to make. There are other ways to finish this cut that leave less room for error. If you're curious about those, let me know and we'll go over it in another video. But this setup worked so well on the first pass that I didn't want to change my method. So I continued to drop my bit 1/4 of an inch per pass, and eventually I made it through each board with no issues. With this step done, I just have one more cut to make in the shop. This board needs a section removed to fit around the hot tub's platform. I first cut it part of the way through using my table saw, then I make a cross cut with my circular saw. This removes the bulk of the material, but because of the shape of the saw's blade, I have a little cleaning up to do with a pull saw. I pushed really hard to get my shop work finished up tonight, because tomorrow is supposed to be uncommonly warm for December in Maine, and I'm really looking forward to installing this deck on a warm, sunny day. Well, we all knew that was coming. That's alright though. Let's get this deck finished. Everything's lining up pretty well, but a few of my pieces needed some small modifications. I use a square to mark my boards so I can ensure that they're all the same length and make a straight line that follows the wall of the house. I grab these boards and take them to my mobile workshop, and just look at how happy I am to be here. The Nightmare Shop is looking pretty good right about now. Using a circular saw and a speed square, I was able to trim my boards down to size. And in my mind, when making this deck, I thought that everything would either fit together perfectly or not fit at all and need to be redone. But the reality was, everything was just about 1/4 of an inch off to one side. This really sucked because it wasn't devastating enough to have to start from scratch, but leaving it like this wasn't really an option, it just didn't look right. If I could have moved the tub just 1/4 of an inch, everything would have fit perfectly, but that wasn't an option. Instead, I trimmed each board so that instead of having a 1/2 inch gap around my walls like I had planned, I had a 5/8 inch gap. No big deal. But this board couldn't be changed easily. Because it curves in both directions, I couldn't just slide it to one side or the other. The solution I came up with was to cut it right down the middle and have my 1/4 inch gap here so that my gaps are still consistent on each side. I wanted to lose as little material as possible, so instead of using a circular saw here, I made my cut with a pull saw. And pro tip from the guy who just told you he screwed up, make sure to coat your saw with snow before using it like I've done here. This way it won't overheat. I was pretty worried about this gap, but once it was in place, it really wasn't that noticeable, and since it's made at the narrowest part of the board, if it is noticed, my hope is that it will look intentional. After this, everything fit into place pretty well, and I was able to start getting my boards installed using some 2-inch trim screws. And if you've ever thought during this or any of our other videos, I'd really like to give that guy some money, but how can I be sure to get almost nothing in return? Well, then I have just the thing for you. As of the release of this video, we're launching a Patreon, and in all honesty, I'm really excited about it. I've got some ideas for content that I'd like to see on here, but what I'd really like is to hear from the people who are interested in it. Signing up early will let you help to shape the community that we build here. Maybe you want question and answers videos, or plans for some of our builds. Maybe you want shoutouts during the videos, or to suggest things you'd like to see me build. Maybe it's none of these. But if you're interested in joining, I'd love to have your help shaping the future of this channel. And for the first 10 members who sign up, after a couple of months, I'll send out a little thank you gift. I'm not sure just what it will be yet, but if I had to guess, I'd say some stickers, a t-shirt, or maybe a brand new car. If you're interested, there's a link below, and if you're not, or don't have the cash right now, no stress. One way to make mission is, and always will be, to create free content for all who want it. Now, let's finish up this deck. The last step was to attach my front step. I screwed through the deck and into the base of the step, then measured and installed my riser with a couple more trim screws. And with that, this build is done. This build was definitely out of my comfort zone, but I'm so happy with how it came out and all the lessons that it taught me. Let me know what you think of it, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one.